Chapter 1. The Invitation to St. Mary's Manor. The frost had settled over St. Mary Mead like a delicate lace shawl, softening the edges of the village's thatched cottages and turning the lanes into glistening ribbons under the December sun. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlour window, her knitting needles clicking softly, her sharp eyes occasionally drifting to the garden, where the last roses clung stubbornly to life. It was the sort of morning that invited quiet reflection, but the arrival of the postman disrupted her reverie. "Letter for you, Miss Marple," called young Tommy Pierce, his cheeks ruddy from the cold as he handed her a cream-coloured envelope sealed with a wax crest. The paper was heavy, expensive, and bore the unmistakable air of importance. "Thank you, Tommy," she said, her voice gentle but with a hint of curiosity. She adjusted her spectacles and examined the envelope. The crest was unfamiliar, a stylized hawk clutching a rose, and the address read St. Mary's Manor, Upper Mead. Sir Henry Ashford's residence, no doubt. The reclusive baronet had purchased the manor 3 years ago, but was seldom seen in the village, save for the occasional glimpse of his Rolls-Royce gliding through the lanes. Miss Marple slit the envelope with a letter opener and unfolded the invitation within. The calligraphy was precise, inviting her to a Christmas party at the manor on the 23rd of December, 2 days hence. A festive gathering to celebrate the season, it read, signed with Sir Henry's bold flourish. She pursed her lips, her mind already turning. Sir Henry was not known for sociability. Why now? And why her, a spinster of modest means, among his surely more illustrious acquaintances? She set the invitation on her tea-table and resumed her knitting, though her thoughts were far from the scarf taking shape in her hands. St. Mary Mead was a small village, and gossip was its lifeblood. Sir Henry's name had been whispered often of late. Rumours of a contested will, a missing family heirloom, and a falling out with his only nephew Edward. Mrs. Bantry, at the vicarage tea last week, had mentioned Sir Henry's health was failing, though Dr. Haydock dismissed it as village exaggeration. "He's fit as a fiddle, that one," the doctor had said, but his eyes had lingered on his teacup a moment too long. Miss Marple's needles paused. Invitations like this were rarely without purpose. She recalled a similar affair years ago in Chipping Cleghorn, when a seemingly innocent announcement in the Gazette had led to murder. "People are so very predictable," she murmured to herself, "and yet so very surprising." That afternoon she ventured to the village shop to post a reply. Mrs. Weatherby, behind the counter, was quick to pounce. "Heard you got one of Sir Henry's invitations, Miss Marple," she said, her eyes gleaming. "Half the village is talking about it. They say he's invited a queer lot. Some London folk, a foreign lady, even that maid of his, Clara, who's no better than she ought to be." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her ears pricked. "And what else do they say?" "Oh, all sorts. That Sir Henry's rewriting his will, that he's got a sapphire the size of a pigeon's egg hidden somewhere in that manor, that he's only throwing this party to settle old scores." Mrs. Weatherby leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Mark my words, Miss Marple, there's something odd about it. You'll keep an eye out, won't you?" Miss Marple smiled, her blue eyes twinkling. "I always do, Mrs. Weatherby." As she stepped back into the frosty air, the invitation seemed to weigh heavier in her reticule. St. Mary's Manor loomed on the hill beyond the village, its chimneys just visible through the bare trees. Whatever Sir Henry's intentions, Miss Marple sensed the threads of a mystery already weaving themselves together. She would attend the party, of course, not out of vanity, but because, as she often remarked, human nature was the same everywhere. whether in a village parlour or a grand manor. And human nature, she knew, could be terribly revealing. Before we move on, Detective, where in the world are you solving mysteries with us? Drop your location in the comments. And if you're craving more twisted tales, hit subscribe. Tomorrow's case file gets even darker. Stay sharp. Chapter 2. Arrival at the Manor. The lane to St. Mary's Manor wound upward through a copse of skeletal oaks, their branches clawing at the pale December sky. Miss Marple, bundled in her best wool coat and a sensible hat, sat in the back of the village taxi, her small suitcase at her feet. The driver, old Mr. Polk, was unusually silent, his eyes darting to the manor's distant silhouette, as if it held some unspoken menace. "Not many come up this way, Miss Marple," he ventured at last. "Sir Henry keeps to himself, don't he?" "Indeed he does," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but her mind alert. She noted the manor's iron gates, rusted at the hinges, and the overgrown ivy clinging to the stone walls. Neglect, she thought, or perhaps something more deliberate. The taxi rattled to a stop before the manor's entrance, a towering Gothic structure of grey stone, its windows glowing faintly against the gathering dusk. A young footman, stiff in his livery, took her suitcase, and Miss Marple stepped into the grand hall. The air was heavy with the scent of polished oak and beeswax, undercut by a faint chill that no roaring fire could dispel. A chandelier glittered overhead, casting shadows that danced across portraits of stern-faced Ashfords. "Miss Marple, how good of you to come!" Sir Henry Ashford descended the staircase, his silver hair gleaming under the light. He was a tall man, nearing 60, with a hawkish face and eyes that seemed to weigh every soul they met. His smile was warm, yet Miss Marple detected a strain in it, like a man playing a cue's part. "I trust the journey was pleasant." "Quite pleasant, thank you," she said, her eyes taking in the room. A maid, Clara presumably from Mrs. Weatherby's gossip, hovered near the door, her dark eyes flitting nervously. She was young, with a sharp, pretty face that suggested more ambition than her station allowed. Sir Henry ushered her toward the drawing-room, where the other guests were gathered. "Allow me to introduce you," he said, his voice carrying a practised charm. The room was a study in opulence. Velvet drapes, a grand piano, and a Christmas tree adorned with glass baubles. Yet the guests sipping sherry by the fire seemed as mismatched as a jigsaw puzzle forced together. First was Mrs. Lavinia Drake, a widow from London, her crimson gown a touch too bold for the country. Her laugh was loud, her eyes calculating, as she spoke to a young man Miss Marple recognised as Edward Ashford, Sir Henry's nephew. Edward's handsome face was clouded, his jaw tight, as he nodded at his aunt's chatter. "Edward's been abroad," Mrs. Drake said, catching Miss Marple's gaze. "Haven't you, dear? Something about a business venture gone sour." Edward's smile was thin. "A temporary setback, Aunt Lavinia, nothing more." Miss Marple noted the way his hand tightened around his glass. Next was Mademoiselle Celeste Dubois, a Frenchwoman with porcelain skin and a sleek chignon, her accent as polished as her emerald necklace. She spoke little, but her eyes followed Sir Henry with an intensity that suggested more than casual acquaintance. "A pleasure, Mademoiselle Marple," she said, her voice like silk. Miss Marple smiled, wondering what brought a woman of such elegance to this remote manor. Then there was Mr. Reginald Poole, a solicitor with a pinched face and a habit of adjusting his spectacles. "Sir Henry's man of business," he introduced himself, bowing slightly. "I handle his affairs, legal ones, of course." His laugh was nervous, and Miss Marple caught the glance he shot at Clara, who quickly looked away. Lastly, Dr. Arthur Langley, A local physician stood by the window, his round face flushed from sherry or unease. "Didn't expect to see you here, Miss Marple," he said jovially. "Thought you'd be knitting by the fire, not gallivanting at manor parties." His tone was kind, but his eyes lingered on Sir Henry, as if searching for something. As Sir Henry called for another round of drinks, Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her side. The room buzzed with polite chatter, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of tension. Glances exchanged, words left unsaid. She thought of her nephew Raymond's theatre friends, how they played their roles off stage as well as on. These guests, she suspected, were no different. And Sir Henry, with his grand manner and grander secrets, was the director of this curious play. "Tomorrow's festivities will be splendid," Sir Henry announced, raising his glass. "A Christmas to remember." The guests echoed his toast, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Something in his voice, a tremor perhaps, suggested he meant more than he said. She smiled demurely, her needles clicking softly, and resolved to watch closely. In her experience, parties like this rarely went as planned. Chapter 3. The festive evening begins. The dining room of St. Mary's Manor glittered under the soft glow of candelabra, their flames reflecting off polished silver and crystal glassware. The long mahogany table was draped in damask, adorned with holly sprigs and crimson ribbons, and the air carried the rich aroma of roasted pheasant and mulled wine. Miss Marple, seated between Dr. Langley and Mademoiselle Dubois, observed the scene with her usual quiet attentiveness, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The Christmas party had begun, but the warmth of the season seemed to falter against the chill of the guests' guarded smiles. Sir Henry Ashford presided at the head of the table, his presence commanding despite the slight stoop in his shoulders. He wore a velvet smoking jacket, its deep green a nod to the festive occasion, but his eyes held a glint that Miss Marple found unsettling, like a man who knew a secret and relished keeping it. The other guests, now dressed in evening finery, filled the room with a hum of conversation that felt more obligatory than joyful. Mrs. Lavinia Drake, her crimson gown catching the candlelight, was regaling Edward Ashford with a story about a London gala. "You should have seen the Duke's face when the champagne fountain toppled," she said, her laugh a touch too loud. Edward nodded politely, but his eyes kept drifting to his uncle, who was speaking in low tones to Mr. Poole, the solicitor. Clara, the maid, moved silently around the table, pouring wine with a precision that belied her earlier nervousness. Miss Marple noted how Clara's gaze lingered on Mademoiselle Dubois, who sipped her wine with studied indifference. "Miss Marple, do you often attend such grand affairs?" Dr. Langley asked, his tone jovial, but his fingers drumming on the tablecloth. "I'd wager St. Mary Mead keeps you busy enough without manor parties." "Oh, I find village life quite sufficient for observation," Miss Marple replied, her smile mild. "People are much the same, whether in a cottage or a manor. Don't you agree, Doctor?" Dr. Langley chuckled, but his eyes flicked towards Sir Henry. "Quite so, though some folk are more complicated than others." As the first course was cleared, consommé served with delicate precision, Sir Henry rose, tapping his glass with a spoon. The room fell silent, the clink of cutlery stilled. "My dear friends," he began, his voice resonant yet tinged with an odd cadence, "I am delighted to welcome you to St. Mary's Manor for this Christmas celebration. It is a time for joy, for reconciliation and—" He paused, his eyes sweeping the table, "for truths to be revealed." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her napkin. "Truths to be revealed?" It was an unusual choice of words for a festive toast. She glanced at the others. Edward's jaw was set. Mrs. Drake's smile faltered, and Mademoiselle Dubois' hand froze mid-sip. Mr. Poole adjusted his spectacles, his face pale, while Clara, standing by the sideboard, seemed to hold her breath. To old friends and new beginnings, Sir Henry continued, raising his glass. The guests echoed the toast, their voices uneven, and Miss Marple joined in, her mind racing. Sir Henry's words carried a weight that suggested more than holiday cheer. She thought of her friend Mrs. Bantry's gossip about his will and the rumoured sapphire. Was this party a stage for some grand announcement, or something more sinister? The meal resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. Mrs. Drake's chatter grew forced. Edward pushed his food around his plate, and Mademoiselle Dubois excused herself briefly, her silk scarf trailing like a whisper. Miss Marple caught Clara watching the Frenchwoman's departure, her expression unreadable. Dr. Langley, meanwhile, leaned toward Mr. Poole, murmuring something about legal matters that made the solicitor's mouth tighten. As the dessert, a plum pudding wreathed in brandy flames, was served, Sir Henry clapped his hands. "Let us move to the drawing-room for games," he declared, his enthusiasm almost feverish. "A parlour game to lighten the mood. Perhaps a round of murder in the dark." His smile was broad, but Miss Marple felt a prickle of unease. Games, in her experience, had a way of revealing truths better left hidden. She rose with the others, her eyes scanning the room. The decorations were perfect, the hospitality impeccable, yet something was amiss. Sir Henry's toast echoed in her mind, and she recalled a similar evening in St. Mary Mead, when a seemingly innocent game had ended in tragedy. "People do love their secrets," she murmured to herself, adjusting her shawl. And at St. Mary's Manor, she suspected, those secrets were about to cast a very long shadow. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Library. The drawing-room of cooking fire, its crackle mingling with the laughter and chatter of the parlour game in progress. Murder in the Dark had begun with much enthusiasm, the guests drawing slips of paper to determine their roles as detective, victim, or murderer. Miss Marple, however, had excused herself from the game, citing a need for a moment's rest. In truth, her keen eyes had noticed a flicker of movement near the library door, where Clara, the maid, had slipped away moments earlier. Followed shortly by Edward Ashford. Adjusting her shawl, Miss Marple moved quietly down the corridor, her steps muffled by the thick Persian runner. The manor was a labyrinth of oak-panelled walls and shadowed alcoves, its grandeur tempered by an air of neglect. She paused outside the Beer Library, where a sliver of light spilled from the partially open door. Voices, low but sharp, reached her ears, and she leaned closer, her expression as placid as if she were merely admiring the woodwork. "You can't keep pretending it doesn't matter, Edward." The voice was Clara's, taut with emotion. "He's changed the will again, and you know it. You'll be left with nothing." "Don't be absurd," Edward hissed, his tone clipped but betraying a tremor of doubt. "Uncle Henry's just playing games, as always. That sapphire, if it even exists, is mine by right. He promised it years ago." Miss Marple's lips pursed. The sapphire again. Mrs. Weatherby's gossip at the village shop had mentioned a family heirloom, a gem of extraordinary value, but she had dismissed it as exaggeration. Now it seemed the rumour held weight. Clara's voice dropped, almost a whisper. "You're a fool if you trust him. He's brought that Frenchwoman here for a reason, Edward. And that solicitor, Poole's been skulking about with papers all day. If you don't act, you'll lose everything." There was a pause, heavy with unspoken accusations. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her reticule. She recalled a similar scene in St. Mary Mead, when young Tommy Pierce had argued with his father over an inheritance only for tragedy to follow. Human nature, she thought, was so very predictable in its greed. "Keep your voice down," Edward snapped. "If anyone hears, look, Clara, I'll handle it. Just stay out of it. You've done enough already." The sound of footsteps approaching the door made Miss Marple step back swiftly into an alcove, where a faded tapestry concealed her slight figure. Edward emerged, his face pale and his hands clenched, striding back toward the drawing room. Clara followed a moment later, her eyes bright with something that might have been fear or determination. Miss Marple waited until the corridor was silent before stepping out, her mind turning over the conversation like a puzzle piece. She entered the library, a cavernous room lined with leather-bound volumes and dominated by a portrait of a stern Ashford ancestor. A desk stood in one corner, its surface cluttered with papers and an inkstand. But what caught her eye was a small brass key, half hidden beneath a blotter. She did not touch it, but her memory catalogued its presence. Keys, in her experience, often unlocked more than doors. Returning to the drawing room, she found the game in full swing. Mrs. Lavinia Drake was play-acting a dramatic murder, clutching her throat and collapsing onto a settee to the amusement of Dr. Langley. Mademoiselle Dubois stood apart, her emerald necklace catching the firelight, her expression unreadable. Sir Henry, presiding over the game, caught Miss Marple's eye and smiled. "Feeling better, Miss Marple? I trust you're enjoying the evening." "Very much, Sir Henry," she replied, her tone demure. "It's a most illuminating gathering." Her eyes flicked to Edward, who had rejoined the group but stood stiffly, avoiding Clara's gaze. The maid, now serving coffee, moved with a studied calm that did not fool Miss Marple's sharp observation. As the game continued, Miss Marple settled into a chair, her knitting needles appearing almost by habit. The laughter and chatter filled the room, but beneath it she sensed a current of unease. The argument in the library had confirmed the whispers of a contested will and a valuable heirloom, but it was Sir Henry's cryptic toast from earlier that lingered in her mind. "Truths to be revealed," he had said. She suspected those truths were closer to surfacing than anyone in the room might wish. Chapter 5. The lights go out. The drawing room of St. Mary's Manor was alive with the giddy chaos of murder in the dark. The guests, emboldened by Sir Henry's fine sherry and the game's playful suspense, darted between armchairs and velvet drapes, whispering accusations and stifling laughter. Miss Marple, seated near the fire with her knitting in hand, observed the scene with a quiet smile, though her eyes missed nothing. Mrs. Lavinia Drake, designated the detective for this round, was interrogating Dr. Langley with theatrical flair, while Edward Ashford hovered near the piano, his expression distant. Mademoiselle Dubois, her silk scarf trailing, slipped behind a screen, and Clara, the maid, lingered by the door, her tray of coffee cups forgotten. Sir Henry stood at the room's centre, his laughter booming as he clapped his hands. "Time for the lights to go out," he announced, his voice carrying a strange edge, as if he relished the moment. "The murderer must strike. Careful now." With a nod to Clara, he signalled for the lights to be dimmed, a twist he'd added to heighten the game's thrill. The room plunged into darkness, the only light the faint glow of the fire, casting long shadows across the walls. Miss Marple's needles stilled. In the sudden quiet, she heard the rustle of fabric. A muffled footstep, and then a sharp intake of breath from somewhere near the library corridor. The guests giggled nervously, their whispers filling the void. "Who's there?" Mrs. Drake called, her voice half playful, half uneasy. No answer came, only the creak of a floorboard. Then a scream shattered the air, a high, piercing sound that cut through the darkness like a blade. It came from the direction of the study, where Sir Henry had said he'd retreat to play dead for the game. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. She knew that scream was no part of the game. It was real, raw, and filled with terror. "Lights! Get the lights!" Dr. Langley's voice broke the stunned silence, and footsteps scrambled toward the switches. The chandelier flickered back to life, bathing the room in a harsh glow. The guests stood frozen, their faces a mix of confusion and alarm. Clara, pale as the damask tablecloth, clutched her tray, her eyes wide. Edward's hand gripped the piano's edge, his knuckles white. Mademoiselle Dubois emerged from behind the screen, her composure frayed, while Mr. Poole, the solicitor, fumbled with his spectacles, muttering, "Good heavens, what was that?" "Where's Sir Henry?" Mrs. Drake demanded, her earlier merriment gone. She strode toward the study door, the others trailing behind, drawn by a shared sense of dread. Miss Marple rose, her movements deliberate, and followed, her mind already cataloguing the scene. The study door was ajar, the room beyond lit only by a single desk lamp. Sir Henry Ashford lay slumped in his leather chair, his head tilted back, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. A thin trickle of blood ran from a wound at his temple, staining the blotter beneath him. The brass key Miss Marple had noticed earlier was gone from the desk, and a window stood slightly open, letting in a draught that stirred the curtains. Mrs. Drake gasped, clutching Dr. Langley's arm. He's dead," she whispered, her voice trembling. Dr. Langley pushed forward, his medical instincts overriding his shock. He knelt beside Sir Henry, pressing fingers to his wrist, then shook his head. "No pulse. He's gone." Edward's face was ashen, his voice barely audible. "Uncle Henry, murdered!" Mademoiselle Dubois turned away, her hand covering her mouth, while Clara let out a choked sob and fled the room. Mr. Poole stood rooted, his eyes darting to the papers scattered on the desk, as if they held some answer. Miss Marple stepped closer, her gaze sweeping the room. The wound was precise, likely from a small, sharp object, and the open window suggested a possible escape. Yet the snow outside was undisturbed, a detail she tucked away. She thought of the scream, the timing of the blackout, and the argument she'd overheard in the library. "How very curious," she murmured, her voice so soft no one heard. Dr. Langley straightened, his face grim. "We must telephone the police at once. This is no accident." He glanced at the guests, suspicion flickering in his eyes. No one leaves this house until they arrive. As the group retreated to the drawing room, their voices rising in a cacophony of shock and fear, Miss Marple lingered a moment longer. She noted the position of Sir Henry's chair, the absence of the key, and the faint scent of something acrid, perhaps gunpowder, though no gun was in sight. In her experience, darkness had a way of revealing truths, and this darkness, she suspected, had only begun to speak. Chapter 6. The Locked Room Puzzle. The wind howled outside St. Mary's Manor, rattling the windows as the police arrived, their motor car crunching over the frosted gravel. Inspector Craddock, a sturdy man with a no-nonsense air and a moustache that seemed perpetually bristling, stepped into the drawing room, followed by a young constable, clutching a notebook. The guests gathered in uneasy knots fell silent, their faces a gallery of shock, fear, and something less definable. Miss Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, watched the scene unfold, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "Sir Henry Ashford, found dead in his study," Inspector Craddock said, his voice cutting through the tense air. "Dr. Langley, you've confirmed the death?" The doctor nodded, his earlier joviality replaced by a grim nod. "No question, Inspector. A blow to the temple, likely with a blunt instrument. Death was near instantaneous." Craddock's gaze swept the room, lingering on each guest. Mrs. Lavinia Drake sat rigid, her crimson gown stark against her pallor. Edward Ashford leaned against the mantel, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Mademoiselle Celeste Dubois stood by the window, her composure restored, but her fingers twisting her emerald necklace. Mr. Poole, the solicitor, clutched a handkerchief, his spectacles fogging slightly. Clara, the maid, hovered near the door, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "And the room?" Craddock asked, turning to the constable, who had just returned from inspecting the study. The young man cleared his throat. "Locked, sir. The door was bolted from the inside, and the only key was found in Sir Henry's pocket. The window was open, but the snow outside shows no footprints, no way in or out far as we can tell." A murmur rippled through the room. "A locked room?" Mrs. Drake whispered, her voice trembling. "How dreadful!" Edward's jaw tightened, and Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked toward Clara, who looked away quickly. "Impossible or not, someone in this house killed him," Craddock said bluntly. "I'll need statements from everyone. Where were you all when the lights went out during that game of yours?" The guests exchanged glances, their alibis tumbling out in a rush. Mrs. Drake claimed she was near the piano, stumbling about like a fool in the dark. Edward said he was by the fireplace, though he admitted to moving toward the corridor to check on Uncle Henry. Mademoiselle Dubois declared she was behind the screen, adjusting her scarf, and had seen no one. Mr. Poole insisted he was seated near the coffee tray, though his stammer suggested nerves. Clara, her voice barely audible, said she was in the hall, preparing to fetch more candles when the scream sounded. Dr. Langley, mopping his brow, confirmed he was with Mrs. Drake, trying to solve the game's mock murder. "Though I suppose we've a real one now," he added, his attempt at levity falling flat. Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking softly. Each alibi was plausible, yet none felt entirely solid, like a sweater with loose stitches. She recalled the argument she'd overheard in the library, Edward and Clara discussing the will and the sapphire, and the missing brass key from the desk. The locked room was intriguing, but in her experience, such puzzles often had simple solutions, if one looked closely enough. Craddock turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Miss Marple, isn't it? I've heard of your knack for noticing things. Where were you when the lights went out?" "Oh, just sitting by the fire, Inspector," she replied, her voice mild. "I'm afraid I'm not much for parlour games, but I do find them terribly revealing." Her eyes twinkled, and Craddock raised an eyebrow, sensing she saw more than she said. As the constable began taking detailed statements, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the study door, still ajar. The locked room was a puzzle, certainly, but it was the guests' reactions that intrigued her most. Edward's guarded silence, Clara's trembling hands, Mademoiselle Dubois' studied calm. Each was a thread in a tapestry she was beginning to unravel. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a locked door had hidden not just a crime, but a motive rooted in betrayal. "People are so careless with their secrets," she murmured, her needles never faltering. Craddock clapped his hands. "No one leaves the manor until we've searched every inch and questioned everyone. This is murder, and I'll get to the bottom of it." As the guests dispersed to their rooms under the constable's watchful eye, Miss Marple remained, her mind turning over the locked room, the scream, and the faint acrid scent she'd noticed in the study. The game, it seemed, was far from over. Chapter 7. Suspicions and Secrets. The morning after Sir Henry Ashford's murder dawned cold and grey, the sky over St. Mary's Manor heavy with the promise of snow. Inside, the drawing-room was stifling despite the chill, as the guests sat in uneasy silence under Inspector Craddock's watchful eye. The police had cordoned off the study, and a constable stood guard, his notebook at the ready. Miss Marple, perched on a cushioned chair with her knitting, appeared engrossed in her stitches, but her ears were attuned to every word and gesture. Inspector Craddock paced before the fireplace, his moustache twitching with impatience. "We've a locked room, a dead man, and no clear weapon," he said, addressing the group. "But murders don't happen without motive. I want to know what each of you stood to gain or lose from Sir Henry's death." Mrs. Lavinia Drake dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though Miss Marple noted they were suspiciously dry. "It's monstrous to suggest any of us could do such a thing," she protested. "Henry was a dear friend. Why, we were planning a trip to Bath next spring." Her voice trembled, but her glance at Edward Ashford was sharp, almost accusatory. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She recalled Mrs. Weatherby's gossip about Mrs. Drake's past, a widow with a penchant for wealthy benefactors. In St. Mary Mead, there had been a similar lady, Mrs. Price, whose tears had masked a calculating heart. Could Mrs. Drake have been more than a friend to Sir Henry, perhaps expecting a place in his will? Edward, slouched in an armchair, met his aunt's gaze with a scowl. "Don't look at me like that, Aunt Lavinia. I had no quarrel with Uncle Henry." His tone was defiant, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of guilt in his eyes. The argument she'd overheard in the library, Edward's claim to the sapphire and his fear of being cut from the will, suggested a deeper rift. She wondered about his business venture gone sour, as Mrs. Drake had put it. A disgraced heir, perhaps, desperate to reclaim his standing. Mademoiselle Celeste Dubois sat apart, her posture regal despite the tension. "I barely knew Sir Henry," she said when Craddock pressed her, her French accent lending her words a cool detachment. "He invited me as a courtesy, nothing more." Yet Miss Marple recalled the intensity of her gaze during Sir Henry's toast, the way her fingers had tightened on her necklace. A jilted lover, perhaps? In her village, Miss Marple had seen how love could turn to resentment, and Mademoiselle Dubois' elegance seemed a carefully crafted mask. Mr. Poole, the solicitor, cleared his throat nervously. "I was merely here to discuss legal matters," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Sir Henry's will was under review, but I assure you, it's all quite routine." His voice faltered, and Miss Marple noted how his eyes darted to Clara, who stood silently by the tea-tray. The maid's past whispered about in the village as no better than she ought to be, intrigued Miss Marple. Clara's role in the library argument hinted at ambition beyond her station, perhaps a scheme tied to the sapphire or the will. Dr. Langley, attempting to lighten the mood, chuckled weakly. "Well, I'm just the local doctor. No motive here, Inspector. I was only invited for the plum pudding." But his forced cheer did not reach his eyes, and Miss Marple wondered about his murmured conversation with Mr. Poole at dinner about legal matters. Was he more involved than he let on? As Craddock began questioning Clara, The maid's composure cracked. "I was in the hall, sir, fetching candles," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't see nothing, nobody." But her hands twisted in her apron, and Miss Marple recalled her sharp words to Edward about the will. A maid with knowledge of her employer's affairs was rarely innocent in her experience. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her mind weaving connections. The jilted lover, Mademoiselle Dubois, perhaps scorned by Sir Henry. The disgraced heir, Edward, resentful of his uncle's control. The scheming maid, Clara, with her dubious past and bold words in the library. Each had a thread tying them to Sir Henry's death, but the pattern was not yet clear. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a gardener's grudge had unravelled a murder. Motives, she knew, were often hidden in plain sight. "Miss Marple," Craddock said, turning to her, "you've been awfully quiet. Any thoughts?" The room's eyes turned to her, some curious, some wary. "Oh, I'm just an old spinster, Inspector," she said, her smile disarming. "But I do find it curious how people's secrets have a way of coming out, especially at Christmas." Her gaze lingered on Clara, who flinched, and Edward, who looked away. The room fell silent, and Miss Marple resumed her knitting, knowing the threads of this mystery were beginning to tighten. Chapter 8. The Missing Heirloom. The afternoon light filtered weakly through the leaded windows of St. Mary's Manor, casting a pall over the drawing-room where the guests remained under Inspector Craddock's orders. The air was thick with tension, the earlier shock of Sir Henry Ashford's murder now mingling with a restless unease. Miss Marple sat near the fire, her knitting needles moving rhythmically, though her eyes darted to the faces around her, reading their silences as keenly as their words. Inspector Craddock emerged from the study, his expression graver than before. He held a folded document, its edges yellowed, and addressed the room with a brisk authority. "We've found Sir Henry's will, locked in his desk," he announced. "It mentions a family heirloom, a sapphire, the Ashford star, valued at a small fortune. The will stipulates it goes to his nephew Edward upon his death, but there's a problem." He paused, his moustache twitching. "The sapphire is missing." A gasp rippled through the room. Edward Ashford, leaning against the piano, straightened abruptly, his face flushing. "Missing! That's impossible! Uncle Henry kept it in a safe, behind the portrait in his study." His voice cracked, betraying a mix of disbelief and panic. Mrs. Lavinia Drake clutched her pearls, her eyes wide. "The Ashford star? Why, Henry showed it to me once. A gem the size of a pigeon's egg, blue as a winter sky. You're saying someone stole it?" Her tone held a theatrical dismay, but Miss Marple noted the way her gaze flicked to Mademoiselle Dubois, who sat motionless, her emerald necklace glinting like a rival jewel. Mademoiselle Celeste Dubois raised an eyebrow, her voice cool. "I know nothing of this sapphire, Inspector. I came for a party, not a treasure hunt." Yet her fingers lingered on her necklace, and Miss Marple wondered if her detachment was as genuine as it seemed. Mr. Poole, the solicitor, mopped his brow with a handkerchief. "The safe was empty when we checked, Inspector," he stammered. "I helped Sir Henry revise the will last month, and the sapphire was to be Edward's inheritance, provided he met certain conditions." He hesitated, glancing at Edward, who scowled. "Conditions?" Craddock pressed, his eyes narrowing. Poole shifted uncomfortably. Sir Henry required Edward to settle his debts and prove his responsibility. Otherwise, the sapphire and the bulk of the estate would go elsewhere. The room fell silent, and Miss Marple's needles paused. A motive, clear as day. Edward's future hung on that gem. Clara, the maid, stood by the tea tray, her hands trembling as she poured a cup. "I never saw no sapphire," she muttered, unprompted, her voice barely audible. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Clara's quick denial, coupled with her role in the library argument about the will, suggested she knew more than she admitted. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known a housemaid who'd pilfered silver to fund a secret romance. Could Clara have similar ambitions? Dr. Langley, attempting to ease the tension, chuckled nervously. "Well, whoever took it can't have gone far. We're all snowed in, aren't we?" But his jest fell flat, and Miss Marple noted his uneasy glance toward the study door. Craddock turned to the constable. "Search the manor, every room, every cupboard. That sapphire didn't walk off on its own." As the constable nodded and left, Miss Marple's mind turned to the study. The open window with no footprints in the snow, the missing brass key, the acrid scent she'd noticed. These were pieces of a puzzle, and the sapphire was a glittering centerpiece. She recalled the library's cluttered desk, the papers scattered beside Sir Henry's body. Had someone searched for the sapphire's hiding place? "Miss Marple," Craddock said, interrupting her thoughts, "you've a sharp eye. Any theories about this missing gem?" She smiled demurely, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Oh, I'm no detective inspector, but I do find it curious that a jewel so valuable would vanish just as its owner did. People, you see, are often careless with what they prize most." Her gaze lingered on Edward, whose hands were clenched, and Clara, who dropped a teaspoon with a clatter. As the guests dispersed under Craddock's orders to remain in the manor, Miss Marple stayed by the fire, her mind weaving connections. The sapphire was a motive, yes, but it was the human threads, greed, betrayal, desperation, that intrigued her. She thought of a theft in St. Mary Mead, where a stolen brooch had revealed a family's darkest secrets. The Ashford star, she suspected, was still in the manor, and its absence would light the path to Sir Henry's killer. Chapter 9. A cold trail in the snow. The snow fell steadily outside St. Mary's Manor, blanketing the grounds in a pristine white that seemed to mock the turmoil within. By mid-morning, the police had searched every guest room and cupboard, finding no trace of the Ashford Star sapphire. Inspector Craddock, his frustration evident in the set of his jaw, had stationed constables at the manor's exits, ensuring no one could leave. Miss Marple, wrapped in her wool shawl, stood by a window in the drawing-room, her knitting idle as she gazed at the snow-covered lawn. Something about the scene nagged at her, a detail out of place. "Inspector," she said softly, turning to Craddock, who was reviewing notes with a constable. "Might I have a word? I've noticed something outside that may be of interest." Her tone was mild, but her eyes held a quiet intensity that made Craddock pause. "Outside?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "The snow's untouched around the study window, Miss Marple. No footprints, no sign of anyone coming or going." "Precisely," she replied, her smile enigmatic. "But not all footprints tell the story we expect. If you'd humour an old lady, I'd like to take a closer look." Curious, Craddock followed her to the manor's side entrance, where a path led to the garden. The snow was fresh, fallen since the murder the previous night, but Miss Marple's keen eyes spotted a faint trail of prints leading from the house toward a copse of trees at the edge of the property. They were uneven, as if made in haste, and stopped abruptly at a low stone wall, where the snow was disturbed, but no further tracks continued. "Odd, isn't it?" Miss Marple murmured, her breath clouding in the cold air. "Footprints that go nowhere. almost as if someone wanted us to think they'd left the manor." Craddock frowned, crouching to examine the tracks. Could be a servant or someone checking the grounds before the snow got too deep. But his tone lacked conviction, and he glanced at Miss Marple, sensing she saw more than he did. She pointed to a faint scuff near the wall, where the snow was compacted, as if something heavy had been dragged. "It reminds me of a trick I saw in St. Mary Mead," she said. "Young Tommy Pierce once made footprints to mislead his mother about his whereabouts. He'd walked backward, you see, to confuse the trail." She paused, her eyes scanning the manor's windows. "I wonder if someone here has been equally clever." Back inside, the guests were gathered in the dining room, their faces drawn under the weight of suspicion. Mrs. Lavinia Drake was lamenting the confinement, her voice carrying over the clink of teacups. "Trapped like rats in a cage!" she exclaimed, though Miss Marple noted her eyes were dry and calculating. Edward Ashford sat silently, his fingers tapping restlessly, while Mademoiselle Celeste Dubois sipped her tea with an air of detachment. Mr. Poole, the solicitor, was scribbling notes, his hands shaking slightly, and Clara, the maid, moved among them, her face pale but composed. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the footprints. The study window had shown no tracks, suggesting the killer hadn't fled that way. Yet the open window and the acrid scent she'd noticed hinted at a deliberate misdirection. The dead-end trail in the snow was another puzzle piece, pointing to someone within the manor, someone clever enough to stage an escape that never happened. She recalled the missing brass key and the library argument about the sapphire. Could the footprints be a ruse to divert suspicion from the true hiding place of the gem? "Miss Marple, you're deep in thought," Dr. Langley said, approaching with a forced smile. "Found any clues in that knitting of yours?" His tone was light, but his eyes lingered on her, as if gauging her suspicions. "Oh, I'm just wool-gathering, Doctor," she replied, her smile disarming. "But I do find it curious how things are not always as they seem. Footprints, for instance, can tell such different stories." She noted his quick glance toward the window, and her mind filed it away. As Craddock called the group to order for another round of questioning, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. The footprints, the sapphire, the locked room, they were all threads in a tapestry of deception. In her experience, such trails, even dead ends, led to truths if one followed them patiently. And patience, she knew, was her greatest ally in unravelling the secrets of St. Mary's Manor. Chapter 10. The Guests' Alibis. Unravel, the clock in the drawing-room of St. Mary's Manor ticked relentlessly, its measured rhythm a stark contrast to the mounting tension among the guests. The snow outside had thickened, sealing the manor in a cocoon of white, while inside, Inspector Craddock's investigation pressed forward with dogged precision. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the strained voices around her. Her gentle demeanour belied the sharpness of her observations as she watched the guests squirm under Craddock's renewed questioning about their whereabouts during the blackout. "I've heard your stories," Craddock said, his voice sharp as he stood before the group. "But alibis are only as good as the truth behind them. Someone in this room was near the study when Sir Henry was killed. Let's go over it again." Mrs. Lavinia Drake, fanning herself with a lace handkerchief, repeated her claim of stumbling near the piano during the blackout. "It was pitch dark, Inspector. I nearly tripped over the rug." Her indignation was convincing, but Miss Marple noted the way her eyes darted to Edward, as if seeking his corroboration. Edward Ashford, his face drawn, insisted he was by the fireplace, though he admitted to stepping toward the corridor to check on Uncle Henry. His voice was steady, but Miss Marple recalled his heated words with Clara in the library about the sapphire and the will. His alibi, she thought, was too conveniently vague. Mademoiselle Celeste Dubois maintained she was behind the screen, adjusting her scarf. "I saw nothing, heard nothing, until the scream," she said, her French accent lending her words a melodic calm. Yet Miss Marple's memory snagged on the timing. Celeste had emerged from the screen moments after the lights returned, her scarf perfectly in place. Could she have moved further than she claimed? Mr. Poole, the solicitor, reiterated his story of sitting near the coffee tray, his nervous stammer more pronounced. I didn't move an inch, Inspector. Ask Dr. Langley." But Dr. Langley, when pressed, hesitated, his jovial mask slipping. "Well, I was with Mrs. Drake, but I suppose I didn't see Mr. Poole the whole time," he admitted, his face flushing. Clara, the maid, stood by her claim of being in the hall, fetching candles. "I was nowhere near the study, sir," she said, her voice trembling. But Miss Marple's keen eyes caught a discrepancy. During the game, she'd seen Clara's tray of coffee cups on the sideboard untouched, suggesting she hadn't been preparing to fetch anything. A small lie, perhaps, but in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had learned that small lies often hid larger truths. She decided to test the waters. "Oh, Clara, dear," she said, her voice as gentle as a grandmother's. "It must have been so difficult, managing all those cups in the dark. I noticed you'd set them down before the lights went out. Were you perhaps delayed by something, or someone?" Clara froze, her hands twisting in her apron. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. I was getting candles, like I said." But her eyes flicked to Edward, and a flush crept up her neck. The room's attention shifted, and Craddock's gaze sharpened. "Delayed, you say?" he pressed, stepping closer. "Miss Marple's right. Those cups were on the sideboard when the scream came. If you weren't fetching candles, where were you, Clara?" The maid's composure cracked. I was in the hall, I swear. I got turned around in the dark, that's all." Her voice rose, and Miss Marple noted Edward's sudden stillness, as if he feared what she might say next. Craddock turned to the others. "Anyone see Clara in the hall, or near the study?" Silence met his question, broken only by Mrs. Drake's sharp intake of breath. Mademoiselle Dubois' lips twitched, as if suppressing a smile, while Mr. Poole adjusted his spectacles nervously. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Clara's lie was a thread pulled loose, unravelling the fragile tapestry of alibis. She thought of a case in St. Mary Mead, where a shopgirl's fib about her whereabouts had led to a confession of theft. Clara's connection to Edward, her knowledge of the sapphire, and her dubious past, hinted at by village gossip, made her a figure of interest. But was she the killer, or merely a pawn in someone else's game? "People do get turned around in the dark," Miss Marple said mildly, her eyes meeting Clara's. "But it's curious how the truth finds its way to the light." Clara looked away, and Miss Marple's mind turned to the footprints in the snow, the missing sapphire, and the locked study. The lie, she knew, was a step toward the truth, and she would follow it as patiently as she followed her stitches. Chapter 11. The Hidden Passage. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across St. Mary's Manor. The snow outside, piling higher against the windows as if to seal the secrets within. The guests, confined to the drawing-room under Inspector Craddock's orders, sat in a strained silence, their earlier bravado eroded by the weight of suspicion. Miss Marple, her knitting a soft rhythm in the quiet, watched the flickering firelight play across their faces, each one a mask hiding its own truths. Clara's faltering alibi had tightened the noose of scrutiny, and the missing Ashford Star sapphire loomed large in everyone's thoughts. Inspector Craddock returned from the study, his expression a mix of triumph and exasperation. He held a small, worn book, a ledger by the look of it, and addressed the room with renewed vigour. "We've found something," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "A hidden passage leading from the study to the library. It explains how the killer entered and left a locked room." A murmur of astonishment rippled through the group. Mrs. Lavinia Drake gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "A secret passage in this day and age? It's like something out of a Gothic novel." Edward Ashford's eyes narrowed, his fingers tightening on the arm of his chair, while Mademoiselle Celeste Dubois leaned forward, her composure momentarily shaken. Mr. Poole, the solicitor, dropped his handkerchief, and Clara, standing by the tea-tray, froze, her face pale. "How did you find it?" Dr. Langley asked, his voice betraying a mix of curiosity and unease. Craddock gestured to the constable, who stood awkwardly holding a crowbar. "The ledger was in Sir Henry's desk," Craddock explained. "It detailed the manor's original plans, including a priest hole from the Elizabethan era, modified into a passage. A panel behind the study's bookcase slides open, leading to the library. No need for keys or windows. The killer could have slipped in and out, unseen." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. The locked room puzzle had been a knot in the mystery, but this passage was a new thread. She recalled the brass key she'd seen on the study desk, now missing, and the acrid scent she'd noticed, perhaps a distraction to mask the passage's use. In St. Mary Mead, she'd once uncovered a hidden door behind a vicarage fireplace leading to a smuggler's cache. Old houses, she knew, held secrets as stubbornly as their occupants. "Who knew about this passage?" Craddock demanded, his eyes scanning the room. "It's not common knowledge, I'd wager." Edward shifted uncomfortably. I knew the manor had old quirks, but not specifics. Uncle Henry never mentioned a passage." His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the way his gaze flicked to Clara, who looked down quickly. Mr. Poole cleared his throat, his spectacles glinting. "As Sir Henry's solicitor, I was aware of the manor's history, but only vaguely. The ledger was in his private papers. I never saw it." His nervous stammer returned, and Miss Marple wondered if his knowledge extended further than he admitted. Mademoiselle Dubois shrugged, her voice cool. "I am a guest, Inspector. Old English houses and their secrets are new to me." Yet her fingers toyed with her emerald necklace, a gesture Miss Marple found telling. Mrs. Drake claimed ignorance, her protestations loud but unconvincing, while Dr. Langley chuckled nervously. "I'm just the doctor. Old passages aren't my line of work." Clara, when pressed, shook her head vigorously. "I'm just a maid, sir. I clean what I'm told. I didn't know nothing about no passage." But her trembling hands betrayed her, and Miss Marple recalled her role in the library argument, her knowledge of the will and sapphire. Could Clara have stumbled upon the passage in her duties, or been guided to it? Craddock turned to Miss Marple, his expression half exasperated, half hopeful. "Miss Marple, you've a knack for seeing through things. Any thoughts on this passage?" She smiled demurely, her needles resuming their rhythm. "It's a curious thing, Inspector, how hidden ways reveal so much. A passage like that might be used by anyone with knowledge and a purpose. I wonder who had both." Her gaze lingered on Clara, then Edward, and finally Mr. Poole, whose handkerchief was now a crumpled mess. As Craddock ordered a thorough search of the passage, Miss Marple's mind turned to the footprints in the snow, the missing sapphire, and the library's cluttered desk. The passage explained the locked room, but it raised a new question. Who had known enough, and been bold enough, to use it? She thought of a saint, Mary Mead Villager, who'd used a hidden attic to conceal stolen goods. Secrets, she knew, had a way of slipping through even the smallest cracks, and this passage was far from the last word in the manor's mystery. Chapter 12. The Christmas Eve Revelation. The drawing-room of St. Mary's Manor was hushed on Christmas Eve, the flickering firelight casting long shadows across the guests' weary faces. The snow outside had ceased, leaving a silent, glittering world beyond the windows. Inspector Craddock stood by the mantel, his moustache bristling with anticipation, while the guests, Mrs. Lavinia Drake, Edward Ashford, Mademoiselle Celeste Dubois, Mr. Poole, Dr. Langley, and Clara, sat in a tense semicircle, their eyes fixed on Miss Marple. She stood before them, her slight figure framed by the Christmas tree, its glass baubles glinting like the missing Ashford star sapphire. Her knitting lay folded in her lap, her hands clasped, and her voice, when she spoke, was as calm as a village tea party. "I've always found," Miss Marple began, her eyes twinkling with quiet authority, "that people's secrets are like threads in a tapestry. Tug at one, and the whole pattern unravels. Sir Henry Ashford's death, you see, was woven from such threads, greed, betrayal, and a past that refused to stay buried." Mrs. Drake gasped, clutching her pearls. "Miss Marple, surely you don't mean one of us?" Her voice faltered, but Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "Let us start with the facts," she continued. "Sir Henry was killed in a locked study, struck by a blunt instrument, a paperweight, as it happens, found hidden in the passage to the library. The Ashford star sapphire, meant for Edward, was missing, and footprints in the snow led nowhere. A clever puzzle, but human nature is rarely so complicated." She turned to Edward, whose face was pale. "You, Edward, feared losing your inheritance. I overheard you in the library, arguing with Clara about the will and the sapphire. You believed Sir Henry was about to disinherit you for your failed ventures abroad. A strong motive, perhaps, but your hesitation in the drawing-room suggested guilt, not cunning." Edward's jaw tightened. "I didn't kill him. I loved my uncle, whatever he thought of me." Miss Marple nodded, her expression kind but unyielding. "I believe you. Your anger was real, but it lacked the calculation of murder." Her gaze shifted to Clara, who shrank back, her hands twisting in her apron. "Clara, you lied about fetching candles during the blackout. You were near the study, weren't you? Your knowledge of the will and the passage came from more than servants' gossip." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't do it, miss. I swear. I only knew about the passage because I heard Sir Henry talking to Mr. Poole." Mr. Poole started, his spectacles slipping. "Nonsense! I never—" But Miss Marple raised a hand, silencing him. "You, Mr. Poole, knew of the passage from the ledger, as you admitted. You also knew Sir Henry was revising his will, potentially cutting Edward out. But there's more." She turned to Mademoiselle Dubois, whose composure faltered, her fingers clutching her emerald necklace. "Mademoiselle, your detachment was a mask. You are no stranger to Sir Henry. You were his fiancée, years ago, before he broke it off abruptly, leaving you in Paris. That necklace, emerald, not sapphire, was a gift from him, wasn't it? A token to ease his guilt." The room gasped, and Celeste's face drained of colour. "How did you—" she began, then stopped, her voice breaking. Miss Marple's smile was gentle. A village like St. Mary Mead teaches one to notice patterns. Your intensity during Sir Henry's toast, your lingering glances, they spoke of a personal wound. But you didn't kill him. Your pride wouldn't allow it. She turned to the group, her voice firm. The killer was someone who knew the passage, the Sapphire's hiding place, and Sir Henry's past. Someone who used the blackout to strike, then staged the footprints to suggest an outsider. Dr. Langley. The doctor's jovial mask shattered, his face ashen. Me! That's preposterous! I'm a doctor, not a murderer. Miss Marple's eyes were unrelenting. You were Sir Henry's confidant, privy to his secrets. Years ago, in India, you served with him in the army. He wronged you, stole credit for a medical discovery that made his fortune, leaving you disgraced and penniless. The acrid scent in the study was from your pipe, smoked to steady your nerves after the deed. You used the passage, known from Sir Henry's drunken confidences, to enter the study, kill him with the paperweight, and take the sapphire, hiding it in your medical bag. Craddock's eyes widened. The sapphire! Where is it? Miss Marple gestured to the doctor's bag, left by the settee. If you search, Inspector, you'll find it wrapped in gauze, alongside his pipe. The constable retrieved the bag, and there, nestled among bandages, was the Ashford star, its blue depths catching the firelight. Langley slumped, his defiance crumbling. He ruined me, he whispered, took everything, my career, my name. That sapphire was my due. The constable seized him, and the room exhaled, the tension breaking like a snapped thread. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her voice soft. Sir Henry's past caught up with him, as pasts often do. A pity, really. Christmas is a time for forgiveness, not vengeance. As Craddock led Langley away, Miss Marple glanced at the sapphire, now safe, and thought of St. Mary Mead, where human nature, in all its frailty, was never quite so surprising. Chapter 13. A Quiet Resolution. Christmas morning dawned over St. Mary Mead with a gentle clarity, the snow sparkling under a pale sun, as if the village had shaken off the shadow of St. Mary's Manor. The manor itself stood silent, its grandeur dimmed by the events of the past 2 days. Inside, the guests prepared to depart, their bags packed under the watchful eye of Inspector Craddock's constables. Dr. Langley had been taken to the station in handcuffs, the Ashford Star sapphire secured as evidence, and the mystery of Sir Henry Ashford's death laid bare. Miss Marple, her small suitcase at her feet, stood in the grand hall, adjusting her hat as she prepared to return to her cottage. Inspector Craddock approached, his moustache less bristling now, his expression one of grudging admiration. Miss Marple, I don't know how you do it, he said, shaking his head. That pipe, the passage, the sapphire. You saw what we missed. I'd have had us chasing footprints in the snow for weeks. Miss Marple smiled, her eyes twinkling. Oh, Inspector, I'm just an old spinster who notices things. People are much the same everywhere, you know, whether in a manor or a village shop. Their motives are rarely as complex as they think. The guests, subdued but relieved, offered their farewells. Mrs. Lavinia Drake, her crimson gown exchanged for a sombre coat, pressed Miss Marple's hand. You've saved us from a dreadful scandal, my dear, though I still can't believe poor Henry. Her voice trailed off. But Miss Marple noted the lack of tears, suspecting Mrs. Drake's grief was more for lost prospects than for Sir Henry himself. Edward Ashford, his face less haunted now, nodded stiffly. I suppose I'll inherit what's left, minus the sapphire. I didn't deserve it, perhaps, but I didn't kill for it. His honesty, Miss Marple thought, was a step toward redemption, much like a young man in St. Mary Mead who'd turned from petty theft to respectability. Mademoiselle Celeste Dubois, her emerald necklace hidden beneath a scarf, offered a quiet "Merci, Mademoiselle Marple." Her pride was intact, but Miss Marple sensed a softening, as if the revelation of her past had lifted a weight. Clara, the maid, lingered at the door, her eyes downcast. "I didn't mean no harm, miss," she murmured. "I just wanted better for myself." Miss Marple patted her arm, thinking of village girls who'd strayed but found their way back. Mr. Poole, his solicitor's composure restored, adjusted his spectacles. "The will shall be sorted, I assure you," he said, though Miss Marple suspected he'd be more cautious with secrets in the future. As the guests dispersed, the manor seemed to exhale, its secrets laid bare. Miss Marple stepped into the waiting taxi, driven by old Mr. Pork, who tipped his cap. "Heard you solved it, Miss Marple," he said, his voice warm with pride. "St. Mary Mead's lucky to have you." She smiled, settling into the seat as the manor receded behind her. "Luck has little to do with it, Mr. Polk. It's only a matter of watching and listening. People do tell us so much, if we let them." As the taxi wound through the village, Miss Marple gazed at the cottages, their windows aglow with Christmas lights. The church bells rang, and children laughed, building snowmen in the lanes. She thought of Sir Henry's past, Doctor, Langley's vengeance, and the sapphire that had sparked such greed. Human nature, she mused, was like her knitting, full of knots and tangles, but with patience it could be made orderly again. Back in her cottage, she set her kettle to boil and resumed her knitting, the familiar click of needles a comforting rhythm. The Christmas party had gone wrong, but the village was at peace, its festive spirit restored. Miss Marple smiled quietly, knowing that even in the darkest mysteries there was always a thread of light to follow.